Alright, let's talk real quick about the two new releases that came out this weekend, both of which can fall into horror, I suppose, though obviously two completely different types of horror. I think we're going to start with Last Night in Soho, which is Edgar Wright's new movie that seemed to have a lot of build-up behind it, particularly being the new Edgar Wright movie, but also him kind of embracing like horror just straight on, as opposed to obviously the many's introduction to him was Shaun of the Dead, which was obviously just as much comedy, if not more so. But this one is interesting because I know he's talked before a lot about how he admires movies like Polanski movies or Don't Look Now and stuff like that. A few things that we've talked about on this channel and did like just last year. And it's interesting because obviously those movies tend to have more of a slow burn kind of vibe, and Wright's movies are known for how almost kind of hyperactive they are as far as the editing and the soundtrack and stuff like that. And how Wright is one of those directors that you can just tell from a mile away if a movie is his or not. And there are a number of moments in this where you can tell it's a Wright movie, but there's also cases where it doesn't feel like him, and it is. I can almost see that being off-putting to people because you kind of go to an Edgar Wright movie for an Edgar Wright movie. But it is also interesting to see him kind of embracing like different kind of styles and different kind of ways of his style of filmmaking, but at the same time, it's still, in many cases, it's still very apparent that it's him. Up to and including stuff like soundtrack and like posters and pictures and stuff like that, where it's clear that this Thomasin McKenzie character is kind of obsessed with the era of the 60s, leading up to what, inevitably the events of this movie are, where she's able to, in a way, in this sort of almost supernatural kind of way, go back to that era through Anya Taylor-Joy, which is, I imagine most people realize is the general setup, and then it goes from there. And the idea that it already kind of feels like the soundtrack and just her bedroom in general are kind of taking us back to the era before we literally go back to the era with her, which is great. And it's clear right away he's also, mirrors are really apparent in this, and that whole, how apparently a lot of it is just camera movement. That's one of those things I was kind of wondering about. But then after I saw it, of course, I was like, taking in as many interviews as I could find of him to see exactly how he approached some of this stuff. And yeah, so the idea that he was going to take the practical approach as much as he could for a movie that's of this particular style feels very unique in itself. And how a lot of it is built up, like as far as Wright movies go, and the whole thing of how I feel like some people might be disappointed that it doesn't completely feel like a Wright movie. Which there are cases where it doesn't, where it does kind of have the more slow burn vibe, even if, like some of the visuals are still, stand out in this Wright kind of way. There are still certain setups, like when we get, like as soon as she arrives, there's the cab driver she has a very uncomfortable scene with, and like just that scene alone already gives you this vibe that even though the place is supposed to come off like this, magical new place that she's going to, we kind of immediately get the sense also that it's like a new and dangerous place to her, and that she is going to be kind of out of place in it. Which is continued by the fact that, of course, she has, an insufferable roommate, and doesn't seem to be meshing with hardly any of the people here except for one dude. Like when you go to a party and how like you find the one person that's like almost your saving grace when you feel way too out of place. So she does find a connection there, but I do think it's interesting how, not just in this sense, but obviously the later sense when it does start to kind of turn into a horror movie, and then when it definitely turns into a horror movie, it's almost like this play on the idea of nostalgia in general, especially for particular time periods where people listen to music and then they'll say like I was in the wrong generation or something like that, and then it's like when you look at history, there were like always ways or reasons where that may not have been an ideal place. Like just based on the good stuff, you assume that everything of a particular era must have been so amazing. And then obviously any era is going to have like its darkness to it, and it's in a certain danger to it. And I like how that seems to be more or less what a lot of what this movie seems to be going for, where it's like you build up the '60s in general here, especially as this big magical place, and you see like all the marquees and all the buildings and all of the dancing and the clubs and all that, and it looks like this this dream of a place. And then obviously the darkness starts to come through after all of that has been established. And I do really like the idea of like actually taking nostalgia down a dark road for once, especially since there's been nostalgia for so many different eras that they've been using for a lot of movies, like particularly like the '80s. But the '60s was a really good use of that era also. Um, and it is there's a lot going on as far as like every time you go into an Edgar Wright movie, especially once you've really gotten to know his style, it can almost be distracting because your eyes feel like they're just constantly busy, where you're just constantly looking for all these details. And for a movie that's as twisty as this one, that might end up being its downfall a little bit as far as the impact of the story and where it goes and the certain beats that it hits, because you're like just constantly looking for things in his movies. And yeah, there are cases where it's not. I don't feel like it's entirely predictable or anything. I'd be lying if I said that I knew every turn it was making. But there are cases also, especially when you reach a certain point where, like, just before things fall into place and just before the movie gets to kind of have its moment, you might be able to put together certain things that are going on. And so it might just lessen the impact a little bit right before it reaches one of its big moments. But we do get a lot of visual flair, as you would expect. Like I said, it's very heavy on mirrors, and knowing that he shot those scenes more or less practically without effects is really great. But there can also be stuff, even if you're a fan of his, there can also be stuff like there's a dancing scene where Matt Smith is dancing with Anya Taylor-Joy, and then she turns into Thomasin McKenzie, and then back into Anya Taylor-Joy, and so on. And then it's stuff like that where it's like, that's really cool, but it also feels like Edgar Wright like showing off. And it could be, and there's a lot of that enough to where it could almost feel like I said, the phrase style over substance kind of drives me crazy, but there are some times where it can be used accurately, and I feel like this movie reaches that point more often than you would hope for. But I said that as far as this first half, it does definitely have something going on, and just the fact that you can feel it building to something sinister, even though nothing's quite in your face. It is when it becomes the horror movie. The horror elements that are introduced don't quite feel as organic as far as how they come into the story. It just kind of feels like it just abruptly becomes that. And another thing that I can say as somebody that does love Edgar Wright is that one of his more beloved movies lately, it seems, is Scott Pilgrim. And while I love the Cornetto trilogy, of course, especially Hot Fuzz, and Baby Driver was one of those movies that I basically knew I was gonna love it before I even went into it, and it lived up to that. If not exceeded it a little bit. But one of his more beloved movies, like I was saying, was especially lately is Scott Pilgrim, and my opinion of Scott Pilgrim is not as high as it is on the other movies. And the reason for that is it gets to this point where it's a great sort of novelty, and it's great to see, the different ways he's playing with filmmaking and setting up the world and doing all this stuff. But at about like the halfway mark, I kind of felt like, now that I get the point and now I get what you're doing, this is where you might want to swerve and do something else. But once it establishes the point, it just kind of does that for a while, to the point that it starts to wear off. And that's pretty much the same way I feel about this one, where it's like it does have like a very repetitive middle, and as far as like visually and what's going on with the story and the stuff that they're playing with, it becomes like it gets to that point of, okay, I get it now. And when you think usually when it gets to that point with the best filmmakers, which includes Wright, then that'll be like right about when you're about to feel like, okay, I get it, then it'll introduce something else, or do something else creative, or take you in a different direction story wise. But this isn't that one. It stays in that area for a while, and then eventually, like I said, that's about when the horror elements start coming in. After that stretch, and then it doesn't feel as, I guess, organic to the story as the other stuff that's coming into it. The stuff where it kind of feels like you could sense some sort of supernatural feel coming or something sinister looming. But when it actually gets there, somehow it feels like this is not what it felt like we were building to. And then as it goes on, like I said, the reveals start to get more. You may not figure them out right away, but the pieces start to become a little too obvious, especially if you're looking too closely because you know Edgar Wright and his details, and how that might come back to bite him a little bit. So that's unfortunate. So I feel better about this movie talking about it than I did watching it, because I felt like, at least in that middle portion and then forward when I was watching it, it was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like it feels very just middling in general. But now that I'm talking about it, I do kind of want to. I am interested to revisit it now and see once again, because even if you seem like you pick up on everything in an Edgar Wright movie, there's a very, very good chance you didn't catch all of the details at least. And even if in his lesser movies like this one, it feels like it's worth going back to see what all else that he put into it, because he is somebody that really, really loves what he does, and the movies come through, and you can see that in them. And it makes it worth giving him the time of day, and to kind of give his movies the chance to fully express themselves. And sometimes you have to go back to them more than once to get everything he was dropping. So it could just be a case of that. But it's I don't know that I've revisited Scott Pilgrim in its entirety since the theater or not, but I have seen a lot of it throughout these 10 or 11 years. So it's maybe those two I'll just kind of like revisit, and then we'll see if I can love them at some point, like I do the Cornetto trilogy or Baby Driver. But we'll see how that would go in the meantime. But right now I just feel kind of like in the middle on it, but it might be settling a little better than I would have expected. So we'll see what the future brings to this movie, and go from there, I guess. So let's go on to Antlers, which is the new Scott Cooper movie, which of course has me very excited because I fucking love Scott Cooper's movies. I really like Crazy Heart, and I thought Hostiles was pretty impressive. But Out of the Furnace and Black Mass, I think I love more than most people do. Both of them made my top tens for their respective years, and I just love them so much. And the idea of him going into horror territory was very intriguing, and then made even more intriguing by the fact that it's based on Nick Anatoska, I believe his name is, who wrote a short story called The Quiet Boy, which I read last year, and it scared the living fuck out of me. And it's, I think I read it in broad daylight too, but just the detail and the setup and the directions that it goes, and how it describes sound, let alone what's happening. It's a terrifying, terrifying story. And the fact that this is more or less a pretty accurate adaptation of it for the most part. It eventually, takes its liberties and goes in certain more predictable directions, I guess you could say. But that's like the very last portion of it. So here, not only do we have Scott Cooper, who I love, but a producer credit for Guillermo del Toro, which you can absolutely tell in the creature design. And it's like the combination of these two people that I love for two seemingly very different reasons coming together. But somehow I felt like it would work, especially with the humanity that you see in Del Toro's movies, even though many of them are monster-themed. We just talked about The Devil's Backbone recently, and it felt like there was a certain combination. You know how Scott Cooper's movies are very much about the characters and the ensemble of characters, and the dark places they're typically coming from, and the hard places they're typically coming from. And the story that this is telling, where even in the short story you really get a sense of there being a certain kind of, not necessarily like character focused in regards to the story, but the fact that you get the sense that there's a clear allegory here. That it reminds me a lot in the movie's adaptation of it. Reminds me a lot of the Stephen King short story Gray Matter, which was like a big allegory for alcoholism and the effect that it has on not just the person itself but the people around them. And there's a lot of that in this, only this is more of, like, I'm guessing a drug allegory, since the characters in it are, like, it's implied that the characters are drug addicts before whatever is going on here is going on. Like, this is the kind of like, town that's riddled by that kind of thing. Yeah, so you have this, as far as it focusing on that, the idea of, this is one of those stories where when it's scary, it's like sad in equal measure, because you can relate the scary nature of what's going on and the horror of what's going on to something that is actually quite real, despite the fact that the antagonist of this story is this otherworldly creature. But the whole idea of facing trauma in general, where we do have our one of our main characters being this child whose father has been changed by what's going on in the town, and to the point that he's basically having to take care of himself and his little brother, and is just left on his own, like, the children that you see are left to fend for themselves, whose parents have, addictions or whatever. And also the dismissive systems who are like, oh, those kids' parents are drug addicts, so and they're just very passive about how those kids are handled. But also our main protagonist, I guess you could say, is Carrie Russell, who is this kid's teacher, and how she's just moved back to this town after having, like, she has her childhood history here was extremely dark and traumatic and ugly, and how she's only just recently moved back and come back to that, and is kind of facing that herself on top of what's going on here, while she's trying to sort out her relationship with Jesse Plemons, who is her brother. And so, as you can see, very sort of character-focused while all the horror is going on. All the other characters are just kind of here, like Amy Madigan's in here, kind of briefly, doing, like, her curmudgeonly best. And then Rory Cochrane is here, who it's becoming one of my favorite traditions that Rory Cochrane's been in, like, the last 3 or 4 Scott Cooper movies. And he's here as well, which is great. And it is very a kind of slow burn thing, and how it's focused very much on the idea of this kid fending for himself, and how Carrie Russell's character kind of feels this almost maternal need to take care of him for that, especially when you see the trauma that she had gone through. How there's very a sort of parental theme going on throughout this. It's definitely going to be slower than probably like general horror fans might be hoping for or expecting. But this horror has definitely been finding an audience over time when you look at, like, A24 movies and stuff like that. So I feel like that crowd would probably take to this quite well. But it still has, like, if you're looking for, like, darkness and gore and stuff like that, that's definitely here as well. This is one of those ones where it might feel more violent than it is in the first half, because we see, like, the relentlessly gruesome aftermath of a lot of stuff, but we don't really see many attacks. But when it gets into that second half, then it becomes kind of, like, brutally violent, and in many sort of unexpected ways, where it's like, and I think that's the thing also, where there's been so much build-up and there's been such a slow burn, like, it kind of catches you off guard, just how brutal it ends up becoming throughout, even though the gore has been present. It's the like, physical violence itself really starts to take over in the second half, and the way they build that up pretty expertly kind of makes it feel like it's excessive, but it's also earned, and very effective when it happens. And there's even one particular jump scare that was very effective, that combines that whole thing of, is gore scary and stuff like that, but it combines the jump scare and gore, and it's, like, somehow, like, extremely effective. Without feeling cheap. And it's also just kind of dark in general, like, it has a very dark look to it, but in this very sort of ominous and atmospheric way, and not that whole thing where it's, like, it's not detrimental in the way where it's, like, it's too dark to tell what's happening, which is really great also. Like, lighting is really well done, but also the way things kind of lurk in shadows, to where the point is that you can't quite make it out until you... if you're meant to make it out, you will know. You will know when you see it. And I would say the only problem would be, like... Well, I don't know. Its bleakness might be a problem for others, but I don't think I personally had a problem with it. Where it could be seen as like bleak to a fault because eventually it can get kind of exhausting how bleak it is. But I think that just kind of speaks to how effective it is and how it approaches like, being a scary movie without really holding back at all. Which sometimes, a little bleakness will be necessary to make something as genuinely scary as this movie can be. So, and when you add like the real emotional elements into it and the allegories and stuff like that, then adding that real factor to the horror only makes it hit even harder and make it bigger and scarier. So there's that. So the climax is kind of more traditional, which is kind of weird given how not as traditional it feels as far as horror movies go throughout. But that's not enough to like hinder the movie itself. So I was really into this, and I figured I would be anyway. Not just because I love Scott Cooper so much, but also the short story involved in that and Del Toro's involvement. It was all just a really nice recipe of things coming together that work on their own and work really well together as well. So yeah, that's great. So I guess we can end this here. Next week is Eternals, and hopefully the French Dispatch will be somewhere near here, which it still isn't. Not even in the out-of-town one, so hopefully that's soon, and then we'll see what else. We're getting into the kind of award season movies now, so we'll start seeing all that stuff, and then we'll finish out, all this October stuff, and see what goes from there. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.